And I don't have PowerPoint today. I just say that God has the power, and I just point to him. Anyway, we're going to start today a little bit different. We're going to play a game. But I need a volunteer. And thank you, Sam, for volunteering. You're the next contestant. Sam, come on down. You're the next contestant on Let's Make a Deal. Give him a big hand as he makes his way down to the front. You know how this game goes? Have you ever watched Let's Make a Deal? Oh, well, you're going to learn. I got something really... in the game, there's doors. There's door 1, door 2, door 3. I couldn't put up doors in time. So I got envelopes 1, envelopes 2, envelopes 3. And here's how it's going to work. I'm going to give you $10, Sam. $10. It's a brand new crispy bill, just printed up this morning myself. It's my side work that I do to supplement my income. So you can have this $10, or you can exchange it for what's in one of these envelopes. And so in these envelopes, there could be like a $20 bill, maybe even more. There might be, a Starbucks card. It might even be loaded. Or the envelope might be empty, but it's your call. So, audience, what do you think you should do? Should you trade this $10 bill in for what's behind envelope 1, 2, or 3? So, Sam, what do you want to do? Take the 10. He wants to keep the 10. That's no fun. Okay. Pick one. 3. It is yours to keep if there's something in there. You give me your $10 back. Yes, that's the way the game's played. Oh, I got an envelope. He drew a dud. Listen, Sam, because you're such a great guy and you're a good contestant, I'm going to give you a second pick. You got a 50-50 chance of getting something out of one of those. 2. There you go. Open that up. Let's see what's in there. What do you think's in there, guys? Well, the reality is they're all empty. That's my way of keeping the $10 bill. But because you're such a great contestant, you do get a card, and it is loaded. Sometimes making major decisions or any kind of decisions in life is a lot like that, isn't it? We have all these options in front of us as we've been looking at the sermon series calling People of the Open Door. And we're not sure which door to go through, which door has the best option in front of us. So sometimes that's how decision is. Now, add to that, sometimes we try to say, okay, so we have to say, what is God's will for my life? Have you ever asked that? And you're trying to figure out God's will. And you think, well, there's got to be some kind of magic solution to how I can figure this one out. We actually have a lot of misunderstandings of what God's will is all about. And I just want to kind of point out a few of them here at the beginning. We sometimes think God's will is about right and wrong. That there's a right thing. He has a right door to choose that you should go open and go through that one into wherever that leads. And all the rest are wrong. And God, it's kind of around that sense, that idea that God has a plan for my life. Well, I hate to burst your bubble, but I've come to the conclusion, we like to say God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. Well, the first part of that statement is really true, okay? God loves you greatly. But I don't think he has a blueprint plan for your life. At least I'm hoping he doesn't, because right now I think I've run out of letters in the alphabet, because I certainly must have missed plan A someplace along the way my life has gone. And I bet you most of you have missed plan A as well, if you thought there was a plan A. I prefer to think that God has a purpose for my life. And that means sometimes that he says, here's your opportunities, here's the options before you. You choose. I'll be in whichever one you choose, as long as you choose it in a way and you follow through in a way that honors me. So that's one misunderstanding we have. We have another misunderstanding is that if we choose the right one and we go through that open door that God has opened for us, he's going to work it all out, right? He's going to make your path smooth. It's all going to be, everything's going to fall in place as you go through there. But the truth is, nothing could be farther from the truth. You actually find, and I don't want to discourage you in this sense, you actually find when you follow God's leading in your life, you often end up facing more challenges and obstacles and obstructions along the way and conflict on the way. And there's a reason for that. You see, if you're following God's leading, you're on the front line of what God is doing. You're also lining yourself up against everything that is opposed to what he is doing. And you have to, conflict is a natural byproduct of being actively involved in a very effective way in God's work. Well, then sometimes we think, well, the other misunderstanding we have is, well, if the door is closed, that means God's not in it. If we thought that, if that was really true, honestly, most of our missions work would never happen. I think I was just talking to Sue about doing a historical movie here that OMF is doing on Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor would have never gone where he went and accomplished what he accomplished if he would have looked at a closed door as being, okay, God doesn't want me to come here. My parents were pioneer missionaries in Ecuador. Ecuador had a president that was not long before them that said, as long as Chimborazo, their highest mountain, actually tallest mountain in South America, in the Andes, is standing, Ecuador will never allow evangelicals into the country. Within about 5 years or so after that, after he said that, missions were coming into the country. I'm a good Latino, and I think God thinks this way sometimes too, not to superimpose my thinking on God, but sometimes we do that, don't we? Is wherever there's a closed door, I'm going to find an open window. And that's the way we sometimes have to go about things. So a closed door does not necessarily mean that God's in it. We need some discernment. We'll get to that. Sometimes we look at what it is and we think of what God might be calling us to do, and we just simply say, I just don't have what it takes. I'm not spiritual enough. I'm not spiritually mature enough. I don't know enough about the Bible. I don't know enough about God. I just don't know enough. I'm not gifted enough. Or I feel very insignificant. Listen, if you think that way, you're in really good company. You have to go back and read in Exodus about Moses when God calls him in the burning bush to say, I have a special appointment for you, a special job for you, and there's an open door that you need to walk through to go do this, but by the way, you need to go back to Egypt. He's in the desert because he's fled Egypt because he's a wanted man back in Egypt. And God is saying, you need to go back to Egypt, and you're my appointed man who's going to lead my people, the Israelites, out of captivity in Egypt and take them to the promised land, the land that I have for them. Listen to all excuses that Moses poses. He says, who am I? Who am I to do that? I don't know how to talk. I don't have what it takes. I don't know how to do this. I can't do this. And how will I know that you've sent me? How will anybody know? What shall I do? Well, God's first answer is say, what's in your hand? And I believe he's saying that to you and me, the same thing when he calls us to do this, and we say, I don't have what it takes. And God simply says, what do you have? And Moses says, well, I have my staff. It's my shepherd's staff. And God says, well, throw it down. He throws it down and it turns into a serpent. You see, it's not what you have, but it's what God does with what you have when you put it in his hands that will make all the difference. When Jesus is going to feed the 5,000, they say, Jesus telling his disciples, you need to give these people something to eat. They say, we don't have enough to do. It would take more money than we ever make in a lifetime to feed these people. What are we going to do? Jesus said, what do you have? Oh, we have this little boy who has, few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. His mom packed him a lunch. I would say if Dinah would have been his mother, he wouldn't have had to. She would not have had to multiply the food because there's always more food than we need when somebody has a lunch. But Jesus takes that and multiplies it and feeds 5,000. It's not what you have. And by the way, when Moses said, "How did I know?" And sometimes we want to say, we want to have some kind of confirmation before we get there. We want the whole picture. You know what confirmation God gave Moses? Do you remember that? He says, when you come back to this mountain and worship me here with the people of Israel, then you will know that it was I that was calling you. And I'm thinking, I'd like a little bit more to go on before I kind of go and do this, because you asked me to go talk to Pharaoh, and I got to convince these Israelites that you have called me, and you're saying, when I get back here, that'll be confirmation. Sometimes the confirmation of God's call in our life isn't come with a sense of great 100% affirmation. I know you don't want to hear this, but that's the way it is. Before we go through, God simply invites us to step out, to step faith, to walk through the doorway. And then as we walk by faith, he begins to open up the way, and we begin to see him at work. Remember, how do you spell faith? You forgot last week already. How do you spell faith? Call it out. There you go. R-I-S-K. Where there's no risk, you don't need faith. Let's face it. So there has to be a risk. Wherever God is at work and calling you to go through an open door, it's always going to take faith. If God is in it and God's calling you, it's going to take faith, and it will involve risk. Well, then we kind of throw this one out. Well, my life really, in the big scheme of things, doesn't matter a whole lot, does it? I mean, God's really more concerned about the big things in the world. He's back in the Middle East there, dealing with the issue between Israel and Gaza. He's over there with Russia and Ukraine. He's dealing with the big things. He's dealing with, some of the things that are taking place in Africa where there's maybe some famine going on. There's all kinds of wars going on. That's where he's at work. Who am I? What is my life all about? God has an invested interest in the details of your life and not just the bigger things. But sometimes we impose this image on God, and then we back away from him. We don't spend enough time with him because we think he's very busy with other stuff. I had a learning experience that way, that God taught me a lesson when I was in seminary. Some of my driest years, by the way, were in seminary. But we had a day of prayer renewal. And God brought this image to my mind and said, Don, you need to get rid of, you have this wrong impression of me. See, my dad, and he was one of my heroes, still is one of my heroes in life. I never doubted my dad's father's love for me. He was not expressive. He was a Russian-born German Mennonite that didn't say a lot of things that expressed a lot of feelings and emotions. But I knew my dad cared for me. But I somehow had this image of my dad, which was a closed office door, because he was a very busy man. He was field director. He traveled a lot, and when he was home, if his office door was open, I knew I could walk in there and just sit there. And neither one of us talked a lot, but I could sit there, be in his presence, and that was enough for me. But I knew also that when that door was closed, he was about some really busy stuff, and I shouldn't interrupt him. And what I realized in that day of prayer, where God brought this image to bear on me, is, Don, you relate to Jesus as your brother because your brother's your best friend. But you don't relate to me very well as your father, because you have this idea that your dad is your father is about busy, too many more important things than you. And I had to set that aside. And some of us sometimes think that way, that God is only about the big things and busy with the big things, and my life is very insignificant. You are tremendously significant to God. He cares about your life. Well, to be honest, sometimes wanting to know God's will is more about wanting to know that what we want to do with our lives actually fits with what God wants us to do, doesn't it? We're kind of looking for, God, this is really what I want to do. This is what I want to, career I want to pursue. This is where I want to live. This is who I want to marry. This is who I want to hang out with. This is what I want to do with my life. And would you kind of make that part of your plan as well? Because I think it's a pretty good idea. And so sometimes we're a little bit concerned about that, and we're not too sure that we want to find out what God wants to do, because sometimes we have this caricature of God that his will is for us to do something that we hate. He's going to send us to someplace we never want to live, we don't want to be. And so we have this caricature of God, and we don't ask or do enough to pursue it. Well, we're in this new sermon series called People of the Open Door. And last week we talked a little bit about what it takes to be a church of the open door. But a church can only be a church of open door if the people part of that church are people of the open door. I want to talk to you a little bit more about what that looks like in your life and how we can get there. You see, every day of your life, every day of my life, off and on through the day, we have many different opportunities that present themselves to us. They may be small open doors. Sometimes we have these big decisions that are big doors that we need to figure out how to get through. But there's doors that God has opened for you to walk through every day of your life. He's inviting you when he shows you that open door. He's inviting you in some way, doesn't need to be a majorly big way, to be part of something he's doing in somebody else's life. The question is, are we too busy with our own lives to even see that? Are we too busy with going about? Do we have too much of our agenda that's occupying our minds and driving our lives to have any kind of margin that allows us to actually be involved with something else that God might be doing? Are we willing to have our lives interrupted? But really, the question we often are asking ourselves, how will we know? How do I know that this is something God has opened up for me? How do I know that God's asking me to do this? How can I know that for sure? Well, there is no magic formula. I already said that. There's no steps spelled out. There isn't, if you go steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then you'll know that it's God. But there are some principles that we can live by, and I think Paul lays some of these keys out in the text that we was just read for us to developing a lifestyle, and this is important, developing a lifestyle from which we can know and live out God's will for us in our everyday lives. And so what I would like to do is unpack those verses for a little while here and then bring it in and make an application of lives. I believe with all my heart that these two verses in Romans have the potential to be life-changing, radically life-changing for you. They have been for me. And I think when we begin to understand what Paul is driving at here, and we begin to apply that in our lives and live by that, it can radically change our lives if we respond to it. So here, normally I speak with a lot of notes. I make myself notes. I don't miss something. But I would like to speak to you from my pastor's heart to yours. And so I'm going to have just my Bible open up to the text. We're going to unpack this a little bit, and then I want to bring it in to bring it together to say, how does this fit with the question, how do I know? How will I know where God is at work and where he's leading me? Not just in the big ideas, the big decisions, those two, but with the ones that I'm faced with every day as I go through everyday life. Paul begins by saying, therefore. And I know it seems placé to say, well, whenever you come across therefore, you should know find out what it's there for. Therefore, the word points back to what Paul has been saying all the way along here. He's drawing a conclusion and an application from what he's been doing, not just in the immediate verses just before that, but through the first 11 chapters of Romans. He's been talking about everything that God has done for us through Jesus. He begins at the very beginning by talking about, the brokenness that the world exists in. That the creation itself, it's not just spiritually broken, but everything is really broken. That creation itself groans, waiting for the day of redemption, that the day will come when God does set everything right and set everything right. And he begins with doing that and giving us the opportunity to set things right in our lives, to come into his right relationship with God because of and through what Jesus has done for us. When we begin to embrace and appropriate what Jesus has done for us, he says, we can have peace with God. There's no longer any condemnation. We are adopted into his family as his sons and daughters, his children. that nothing can separate us from the love of God, his love for us. And that regardless of how things have fallen apart at different times in our lives and all the wrong ways, directions we've taken in place, he is able to take everything and work it together for the good and accomplish purpose in the lives of those who love him and are called by his purpose. That doesn't mean he turns bad things into good. He doesn't. But he is able to turn bad things into bringing good out of them. Reverse the consequences, in a sense, of even the bad decisions that we've made. And I have personally experienced that. See, I would not be standing here today had I made some of the right decisions earlier in my life. That doesn't mean that I think it's a mistake for me to be here. But I'm a living witness of how God can take terrible decisions that you make in your life and bring something good out of it and work for his honor and actually give you a place of where you accomplish some things for his kingdom of God. Therefore, Paul says, I urge you. There's a sense of urgency with what he's calling. He uses the same term when he writes in 2 Corinthians. He says, I urge you not to receive God's goodness and God's grace in vain. Because you see, when we appropriate things just for ourselves and we don't do anything else with it, when we just kind of keep it inside ourselves, everything that God's done for us, we're receiving God's grace in vain in our lives. And he's saying much the same here. He says, brothers and sisters, he says, I urge you. There's an urgency in view of everything that God's done for you. Keep it in mind, having talked about all these things that God has already done for you through Jesus. To offer your bodies as living sacrifice, to offer, that is, to put at his disposal, for his use. He's used exactly the same term early in Romans in chapter 6, where he says, don't present your bodies, don't offer your bodies as instruments to offer your bodies to sin as instruments of wickedness, letting lust and all these other things take over and drive you. See, we have a choice. We either offer our bodies, and I want to come back to what that encompasses, for good, to God for what he's going to do, or it's going to be selfish and sinful over this side. Even though sometimes we say, well, that isn't sin itself, but it's ignoring God's grace. It's taking God's grace and receiving God's grace in vain. When he says to offer your bodies, he's saying the life you live in your physical body, which encompasses everything. I like the way Eugene Peterson puts it in the message. He says it's your getting up, it's your waking up and going about your life, going to work. It's everything you do with your life. That's what he has in mind when he says offer your physical bodies as a living sacrifice to God. It's taking your whole life, every aspect of your life, every moment of your life. See, following Jesus is an all or nothing proposition. Now, my heart, my hand, we have made it sound at times like you can be a partial disciple. You can give part of your life to God and you can keep back for yourself. Sometimes I'm asked, when it comes to giving financially, so what should we give? What does the Bible tell us? Should it be 10%? When you're thinking that way, you're already thinking wrong. You already have it wrong. God doesn't want 10%. He wants 100%. That doesn't mean that you have to kind of take a vow of poverty and, give everything, sell it all like he's told the rich man to, and give it to the poor and give it to the church. What it means is God has an invested interest in how you spend the money that you don't give to directly to God's work in the church or wherever you happen to give. You think God cares about sick children? God cares and wants you to be able to donate money to children's hospitals so that sick children can get better. You think God cares about feeding the hungry? We in North America and Western world, in the Christian Western world, have the capacity to not totally eradicate hunger and poverty in the world, but to do a significant dent in changing the way it is if we wouldn't be so stingy. See, the reality is the average Canadian, on an average, just put out it, gives less than 1% of their income to any kind of charitable organization at all, of any kind, stripe or less than 1%. And we think we're generous when we give that 1%. Only 25% of Canadians give enough so that they have something that they can declare on their income tax and get receipted for it. In Canada, we are privileged in many ways that our government acknowledges that giving to a church or religious organization is like giving to a charitable donation. There are pretty much no other place in the world, I don't know what Europe's like, I know Latin America isn't that way. The church survives on the generosity of its people, not because they're getting something back for it. Paul says, offer every aspect of your life. It's an all or nothing proposition. Jesus said, unless you take up your cross daily, unless you deny yourself, and you take up your cross daily and follow me, you're not worthy about being my disciple. That's pretty harsh, isn't it? It's pretty black and white. He's not wanting to be mean or cruel or saying, you can't enjoy the comforts of life, you can't enjoy anything like that. He's saying change your perspective on your whole life. For us, and I'm not saying that we have this nailed. That's why we see our home as an extension of the kingdom of God. It isn't our private sanctuary. It isn't just our refuge. I hope it is a safe place for us, those of us who live there. We also want it to be a place of peace and safety for anybody else who needs to experience that and comes in. Which is why I often say, if my Rogue is parked outside and you come, the door is probably unlocked, come on in. You are welcome anytime. I probably don't turn the lights out till about 1 or 2 in the morning anyway. So if you can't sleep at night, come over. We'll talk. We'll have coffee and then we'll stay up the rest of the night, all night. We were blessed not long ago, and I was going to say we were blessed because my daughter totaled my Cavalier. And that was not the blessing, but the blessing came out of that we had been given significant gifts that we were able to buy the Rogue. And our immediate response is, wow, we got this car at a point where our kids have grown up and we don't need to be trucking them around. What does God have in store for us that we can use this to bless other people? We are blessed beyond all people because we live where we live. Paul says, see your life from this holistic perspective. Offer your lives, every aspect of your life, as a living sacrifice. This is your spiritual act of worship. And the word spiritual is a little bit misleading. He said, this is your reasonable act of worship. It just, given the fact that everything God's done for you through Jesus, this is reasonable. It isn't unreasonable. Sometimes we think somebody, because they do all this, they're being unreasonable. You will have friends and family saying, when you begin living differently, saying, have you lost your senses? But Paul is saying, given everything as God's already done for you, this is your reasonable act of worship. And by the way, we have great times of worship here. We have great worship leaders. I appreciate them and the work that they put into it. But if we think this is only what worship is all about, we're so lost and misguided on that. Paul is saying worship is a whole life experience, that how you live your life out there is as much an act of worship as it is when we come together like here and together we lift our voice in praise to God. In fact, I would say that our capacity to worship when we come together on a Sunday morning is increased tremendously, exponentially, when we live our lives as an act of worship to God every day of our lives. So, how will I know? Well, the first thing is just it starts by saying, God, here it is. I'm saying yes before I even know the question. I don't need to know what you're asking me to, but the answer is yes. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Do not conform. It literally means do not let your life be fashioned according to the world's standards. Do not be squeezed into this mold. It has to do with forming and shaping. And by the way, if some of this sounds familiar, it's because I use this very same text on January 12th, but most of you probably don't remember that. So that's okay, we're going to cover it again. Do not conform. We eat and live and breathe the values of the community in which we exist. There's, in the part of the world that we live, it's consumerism, materialism. It drives us. From the clothes we wear, to the car we drive, to the homes we live in, to the jobs we take on, to the churches we go to. There's sometimes, here's an everyday example of how I at least experience being squeezed into wanting to conform to the pattern of this world. It may sound trite to you, but I'll use it as an illustration. It's when I drive. We lived for a long time here, and then we moved away. We lived in Regina, which is population about 175,000. Then we moved to Prince George, population 90,000. Pace of life in those cities is way different than Vancouver. And I remember one of the first summers that we came back on vacation here, and I thought, there's a spirit about this city that is infectious and contagious, and it's not good. And it has to do with the way we drive. I had all the time in the world. I was on vacation. But all of a sudden you find yourself rat racing around, Speed limit's 50K, but you're doing 60, 70. Some people are doing 80. And you're cutting everybody off. And you got to be first in line at the light there. If there's 3 cars back here, there's only one there. You quickly switch lanes so you get over there. It's contagious. That is an example, friends, brothers and sisters, of the world squeezing us into its mold where we adopt this way of life that's around us. And that may sound trite, but it comes over even in a bigger way in all kinds of other areas. Paul is saying, listen, give your whole life over to God. Let him be the controlling factor there. Let those values. And by the way, every time you walk out that door in the morning and you head off to school, you head off to work, you head off shopping, you're going to had all these pressures are beginning to be forcing against you, trying to get you to be somebody that God doesn't want you to be. You have to push back. If you don't push back, you'll become like everybody else around you. That's just a fact of life. Okay, so here's 2 things that you and I do. When we ask the question, how will I know? Well, it grows out of developing a lifestyle that just automatically begins to do those things. And it comes with this third thing I'm going to talk about. But it doesn't happen, this third thing I'm going to talk about, doesn't happen unless we intentionally do the first 2 things, which is say, God, here's my whole life. I'm not holding any part back. I'm not saying, by the way, when I go out on vacation, that's my time. Or I'm not saying, I volunteer at the church and I do all these different things, but when I'm at home, that's my time. I give, to the needs that are around you, and the church needs money for the building project or for support to, pay the bills, something like that. So I give there. The rest is mine. We change that perspective. intentionally change into thinking that everything that I have, all of who I am, is God's, and I offer it to Him. And as I offer it to Him, I intentionally choose to resist being pushed and squeezed into a mold that is opposite and contrast to the one that God wants me, the person God wants me to be. His will, by the way, for you is that you be like Jesus. That's His will for you. When we do those two things, when we are intentionally operating doing those things, then God does His part, which is what Paul says here, be transformed. We don't transform ourselves. It's as we do these first two things, as we offer our lives, as we resist the forces that squeeze us into a different mold, as we do those things, God is able to change us and transform us from the inside out. Do not conform, do not become like their form, but be transformed. And the word there is metamorphosis, from which we know what happens to a butterfly when it becomes that little larva that spins a cocoon, and when it comes out, it's so much more beautiful. It's something different. That's what God does in our lives. Paul says we are new creations. The old is gone. The new is here. Take off the old, he says. Put on the new. Don't try to put on the new over top of the old because it stinks. It doesn't work. Be transformed. We open ourselves up to be transformed by the Spirit of God who does His work inside. It's not instant. It happens over time. We end up stepping back occasionally. But it's God's work in us, God's transforming work in us that changes from the inside out. I've said this before, but my Bible's about to go. God is not into behavior modification. Behavior modification invariably uses external forces and pressures to create that. God is into heart transformation. Because when you are transformed from the inside out, your behavior follows who we are. We do, and what we do, what and who we are on the inside. Behavior modification only works up to a certain point, but it's when it changes who you are and you begin to behave in a different way because that's who you are on the inside, and it begins to come out. That's when you can consistently be this new person that God has created you to be and is working in your life to be. Be transformed, he says, by the renewing of your mind. The renewal of your mind simply says it's about changing the way you think. Changing your mind about things that you thought about before and allowing Him, God, to influence and change your mind the way you think about things. Changing your perspective. Changing your perspective first of all in your life. Change your perspective of Jesus. God and Paul in 2 Corinthians says, once we used to think of Jesus in this world, but now we don't any longer. We don't see people that way. We see people through the eyes of Jesus because we've changed our perspective. He's made us into a new creation. We are somebody new. We are something new that didn't exist before Jesus came into our lives. Then, and I circle that word then in my Bibles. By the way, I write in my Bible. It's my way of communicating, talking with God. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. See, altogether too often, the question of what is God's will for my life comes up when we have the big decisions to make, doesn't it? And Paul is saying here, forget that. Make living this way, offering your lives, not conforming, allowing God to keep on an ongoing basis doing His transformation. Then you will, on an ongoing basis, in the small things, be able to know and approve and test and approve God's good and pleasing will for your life. How will I know? It's by adopting the lifestyle of Jesus. many years ago. You know, the WWJD came out, the little bracelets people wore. What would Jesus do? Great question to ask, by the way. But here's what I've realized. Is if I have to be asking myself that question, it says there's something not going on, not quite right on the inside. Because when God is doing his transforming work and I'm becoming more like Jesus, then I naturally begin to do what Jesus would do, and I don't have to ask the question. One of the last parables that's recorded that Jesus told, might not be the last one he told, but one of the last one recorded, stands out in my mind in this regard. It's called the parable of the goats and the sheep, and I'll just summarize it for you. It's in Matthew. Because on one side, there's what he calls the goats, and then the other side is sheep. Figurative, okay? And both groups of people are saying, Lord, Lord. And what's Jesus' response to him? Don't call me Lord, Lord. Is it? But what separates the two, one from the other, is he says, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I needed a place to stay, you offered hospitality. Hospitality is to the stranger, by the way, not to friends and family. When I was in prison, you visited me. Both groups of people said, Lord, when did we see you? Both of them asked the same question. But see, those who weren't living a lifestyle that was fully committed to being followers of Jesus, they missed all that. That happened all the time, all around them, but they totally missed it. But those who were followers of Jesus, they asked the same question, when did we see you that way? But they were naturally doing what God wanted them to do because they were living a Christ-like, a Jesus life. Jesus was living his life through him. So they were naturally feeding the hungry. They were naturally, offering hospitality to the stranger. They were naturally visiting the prisoner. They didn't need to ask. When they're faced with situations, what would Jesus do? What is God's will for my life? How will I know? So here's my challenge to you. I try to start most days, and I don't start every day this way. But at some point at the beginning, it might be as I'm leaving the house driving to an appointment or to meet up with somebody. I pray these verses back. Say, God, you're doing a lot of great things in the world today. Could you allow me just to be a part of something? Let me see something you're doing. So I have no idea what this day holds for me. I know the appointments I have. But you know what is. And so I'm just saying to you, Lord, right up front, this is how I'm praying. I have this conversation while I'm driving. You know what it is, so here's my day. I'm right at the beginning of the day. I have no idea what holds. I'm giving it back to you. I know I'm going to feel some pressures along the way to kind of stick to my agenda, to be squeezed into what the world would want me to be doing. But I don't want to miss out on what you're doing, so please give me the strength I need not to conform to the world around me. But change my way of seeing things, change my perspective, my understanding of the world around, so that I can join you in what you're doing. How will I know? By living this way, by making this a lifestyle. We've gone on long enough. We need to close with communion. And I think it's a fitting way to close today's service. And I invite the worship team to come up and lead us in a song as we lead up for this time. And then we'll take it together.